welcome. I'm Carolyn Grimminger with the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin Public Affairs Forum. Our program's mission is to nourish mind and spirit and serve social justice. Our forums occur on most Sundays at noon and are free and open to the public. We encourage you to attend. Our church is physically located at 4700 Grover Avenue in Austin, Texas. And for more information about our forum, such as upcoming forums, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. Today our speaker is Blazek Crossley, and I'm going to be introducing him. Last year, Mr. Crossley launched a new nonprofit think tank called Farm and City that continues over a decade of work on Texas public policy, especially urban planning, transportation, health, and equity issues. Mr. Crossley grew up in Houston, lived in Austin for a decade, obtaining a master's in public affairs from UT. He moved back to Houston for a decade and ultimately settled right back here in Brentwood a couple of years ago with his wife and 3-year-old son. Let's welcome Mr. Crossley.
I want the story of Texas that means open land, green spaces, room to think. I also want the story of Texas that means sustainability, equity, human interaction, walkable places. I want to share our state with the millions of plants and animals and microbes that have been here a lot longer than we have. And I want to share our state with the diverse and evolving human communities across our state. I took a picture of this rainbow in the closing moments of Hurricane Harvey, looking towards Houston. And we still do not have adequate public policy responses to the many crises that happened here. Parents all over Texas and all over Austin beg for an end to the traffic death epidemic, and we do not have adequate public policy responses. And we continue to pave over the hill country, to build parking lots for retail stores for people to drive to from these houses nearby. And we do not have adequate public policy responses to this problem. And so this is my son George and his best friend Phoenix. And I don't want to leave them these problems unaddressed. I want them to inherit a better situation. I want them to inherit a more equitable, sustainable Texas. And I was thinking I should tell you a little bit that to some extent I'm doing the family business. I'm carrying on both my mother's and father's tradition. My mom is an accountant who specializes in nonprofit organizations. So I learned how to file 990s and all your forms from my mom. But my father, when I went on a spring break trip in high school with my dad was the chaperone, and 8 of my friends and I went to Port Aransas, and we spent the whole week running around on the dunes and jumping in the water. And my dad spent the whole week with his first experience of cable television. And he basically sat there watching TV while we played. But the thing that was on is for the first time he watched C-SPAN, and they were doing a special symposium on the limits to growth, which is like the seminal climate change research. And he basically was terrified and spent this whole trip watching the children play and realizing they might not live their full lives because of what is happening with our planet. And so that's when my father changed careers when I was in high school and went on to form a nonprofit in Houston called Houston Tomorrow to work on sustainability issues, to try to preserve this planet and this Texas for me and for my children. And so now that I'm a father, it's a different story. And so 2 years ago I started a nonprofit, 501c charitable nonprofit called Farm and City. And our major things we're trying to change this year, next couple years, is to build more sustainable policies for regional growth across Texas, across all the major metropolitan regions of Texas, to end the epidemic of traffic deaths in Texas, which we lead the nation of 10 people dying every single day. And the Vision Zero project is to end that. Regional equity, and to bring equity concerns to the metropolitan region, where I believe they're more appropriate, or they're equity concerns at all levels. And I think we have lots of good work happening on equity issues at the city and at the county and in neighborhoods, but not at the big metro level. And then transit and access to all forms of sustainable transportation. But what we do is try to shift Texas public policy. But today is Earth Day, and today we're talking about climate change. And something unique happened a couple of years ago is that for Americans, we shifted, where we now, for Americans, we're emitting more carbon dioxide from transportation than from energy production. And this is a lot of what the people in my world are about, is how do we deal with the rising transportation climate emissions problem, which is now bigger than the energy problem. And so I was thinking I'd just do a little poll. Who drove a car or truck here? And who drove an electric or hybrid car or truck here? And so I just wanted to make sure we understand about the carbon emissions involved with vehicle use. There is the thing we mostly think about, which is just the emissions coming out the tailpipe. And if you buy a completely electric car, you can get rid of that part of the carbon emissions. But there's other carbon emissions involved, and there's the embodied carbon of the vehicle when you get it, and the factory that had to be built to create that car, and all the mining to create all the things to build the car. And so the embodied carbon in a new car is equal to about the lifetime emissions from if that car is a gas-burning car. And that's even if you have a Tesla. And so the Tesla still has the embodied carbon of a gas of equal to the lifetime burning of a gas-burning car. Although it's still good to do everything you can. But then there's something else that we don't really have quantified, is the embodied carbon in the infrastructure to support the lifestyle of driving. And if we wanted to move all of us around, all our human bodies around in 2,000-pound vehicles on open fields, it doesn't work out very well. And you need roads, you need parking spaces, you need parking garages, you need giant machines emitting all kinds of carbon to build those roads. And so there's a complex picture of the environmental impact of deciding to drive that's beyond just what's coming out of the tailpipe. And so we've been looking at the Austin region, and we broke it out into 3 different Austins: the urban and suburban and rural. And this is just based on number of people per mile. And so the rural Austin is everywhere in the 6-county region that has less than 1,000 people per square mile. Suburban is 1,000 to 3,800. And then urban is everything that's more than 3,800 people per square mile. And so this is urban Austin. And we broke up urban Austin into a couple more, super urban and super urban. Because in Texas, there really aren't too many examples of very urban places where you can have a low carbon lifestyle. And we used a set of data from an entity called the Center for Neighborhood Technologies out of Chicago, and their Housing plus Transportation Index, which I think is the most important tool on the internet for these issues. And you're able to see what is the actual vehicle miles traveled, how much does the average person drive if they live in this place, what is the average greenhouse gas emissions every year for a household in this place, and then a lot of other things, including affordability. And the really interesting thing, and so we looked at suburban Austin and rural Austin, and one factoid that's interesting in Austin, compared to other Texas metros, there's a lot higher percentage of people in what you call rural. And I think that's part of, there's been a lot of concern about Austin actually being more sprawled than Houston on a percentage basis. And this fact really contributes to that concept. There are a lot of people who live away from a lot of things and other people in the Austin region as a percent of our whole population. And so all these numbers come down to, if you have 3 Austins, the urban one, on average, the people in the urban Austin drive the least and have the lowest greenhouse gas emissions per capita based on transportation. Suburban folks drive more, and rural folks drive even more. But if you look at the super urban places, people in Austin, there are people who live in Austin, Texas today and have very low carbon lifestyles based upon the neighborhood they're in allows them not to have to drive a bunch. And these people are driving almost twice as much as some of our other neighbors. And so there's several places that are super urban, but West Campus is perhaps the greenest place in Texas based on this transportation use. And it has to do with how many people are allowed to live there and how much access they have to things, to school, to jobs, to transit, to walking and biking. And so one question is, how could we have more West Campuses in our region to allow more people to have low carbon lifestyles? And so if you just look at this vehicle miles traveled, which in lots of ways is the key metric for everything, the state of California bases all major transportation decisions and building land development decisions on vehicle miles traveled. And if you want to build a new roadway, you have to show that you will be reducing future vehicle miles traveled. If you want to put in a big building, the question is, what will this do to vehicle miles traveled? Because the state of California believes that that indicator impacts traffic deaths, impacts climate change, impacts all sorts of things. But if you look at any American metro region, there will be the urban core, and there might be different urban cores. And then the further out, the further you are away from other people and things, the more you drive, and then the more carbon emissions per capita based on transportation. There is, for those looking at the maps, there's some funny bright yellow spots, and I believe that's because there's a prison by the airport. This is a large population of people who do not drive at all. And that's where we get that spot. But if you tell me your address, I can tell you on average how much your neighbors are emitting in terms of carbon pollution every year, and I can tell you on average how much they have to drive. And there's lots of ways to look at it. In general, suburban housing types actually cost the cities and counties more to maintain than urban per person. There's lots to debate there. One simple example is that just the amount of road that you need if you live in a dense urban place per person is a lot less. And so we have been looking at the Austin region, and there's the Capital Area Metropolitan Planning Organization is our 6-county government, and that entity is made up of council members and mayors and county judges from all across the region who come together to plan transportation for our whole region. In Texas, you don't have any sort of land use planning or urban planning. There was a bill to start doing that about a decade ago, and Governor Perry vetoed it. And so these MPOs are our urban planning entities for our regions, and the decisions they make are our urban planning decisions that also coordinate with city and county decisions. And so this entity has to track where all of us live. And I'm showing you a map of where the people in Austin live today. And it's a similar as earlier, showing the very dense places and the suburban places and the rural places. And the big story from this map is about 1.5 million people live in suburban and rural places in Austin today. And about 0.5 million live in what you might call urban places. In the official regional forecast for 2040, we are planning on 3 million people living in the rural and suburban places, and just 1 million having access to the urban. One key point here is that in Houston, there's something called the Houston Area Survey, and if you're a nerd, it's one of the greatest nerd tools about a Texas city, because Dr. Kleinberg has been making his graduate students do phone surveys, representative samples of Houston area people for 35 years. And it's the longest running sort of survey of what Americans think in a major city. One of the things they started asking was, would you prefer to live in a large house with a large yard, even if it meant that you had to drive everywhere? Or would you prefer to live in a house where you could walk to places like coffee shops, even if it meant you didn't have as big of a square footage or a yard? And what was surprising almost immediately 10 years ago when they first started asking this is that almost half of Houstonians would prefer the walkable urban experience. And now we are where a majority of the people in Houston, across the Houston region, the 7 million people of the Houston region, 3.5 million of them would prefer to be able to walk to places, even if it meant giving up their yard and their car. And I assume Austin is similar. And so this picture we have of future where we only allow for 1 million people to have urban places to live, and 3 million live in the suburban, is out of whack with the marketplace, with today's marketplace. And as I've sort of been explaining, this is an environmental nightmare. This is the nightmare scenario of vehicle miles traveled gone way further, worse, carbon emissions going way further, worse, impervious surface, building roads for all these things. It's a nightmare scenario. And so could we do something else? And so we've been working on how realistic could we just try to meet the current known demand? And could you have 2 million Austinites living in urban places and 2 million living in suburban and urban? Which would mean we still would build new suburbs, and we still would also build new urban places. And this map is a very rough sketch we made where we simply took the total growth expected in the Austin region and then took every neighborhood or transportation analysis zone and said each one would increase by that same percentage growth. So every neighborhood would be responsible for adding people. That's how we got to this map. But this would be an extremely different climate picture for the Austin region. And so these growth maps, there's a lot of equity issues and a lot of geographic equity issues about the different counties of our region. And there's been a lot of criticism from the nerds about the Campo regional growth forecasts because they take the state demographers' numbers on projected growth and then add some more to it. And specifically add more to Hays and Williamson County. And so that's our official regional plan, is that Hays and Williamson County will grow at somewhat astronomical rates through 2040. And the result is that you end up in a very strange situation in Hays and Williamson County, where they have been going into massive debt to build roads for that expected growth. And Hays and Williamson County now lead the state in debt per capita. And they are assuming that they're going to get all that growth. They're hoping this bet pays off because they will be in more debt than Travis and lots of other counties, even if that bet pays off. They will have been doing a high level of public debt to finance this vision of growth, which goes back to the whole idea is that if you're building a place where you assume people will drive a lot, then you need more roads for each one of them, and that costs money. But another part of it is that the way TxDOT allocates money across our region and the way the Campo allocates money is based upon this regional growth forecast. And so the people of Austin get a little less transportation money per capita than the people of Williamson and Hayes County, because we are apparently assuming that they're going to grow a lot faster. And so this concretely could mean that instead of maybe building so many roads out there, you could be building sidewalks here. And so the problem comes in, if you look over the last 6 years, or 2010 to 2016, of what actually happened with growth in our region. Our region as a whole continues to grow extremely fast and add about 50,000 people a year, which is a lot of new people. Although Houston adds 150,000 a year. And I think Dallas and Houston compete for those kind of numbers. But we're adding a lot. However, turns out that Travis County has grown a lot faster than those regional growth forecasts said that Travis County was going to grow, whereas all the other counties combined are growing slower. And so we are allocating money based on this forecast that we now know there's something fishy there. So there's a bunch of things that are corrupted by this regional growth forecast. It's just sort of fun to go through them. Even Capital Metro is doing a big Project Connect transit process and come up with a beautiful plan, if you had all the money in the world, to build lots of really good transit for Austin. However, when they were selecting which lines to propose and how to submit it to the Federal Transit Administration, they're required to use those regional growth forecasts. And so if proposing a long distance bus line that takes someone from Leander to downtown Austin would seem more reasonable when you're using these growth forecasts if you don't think that the city of Austin will add healthy, low carbon, walkable places. Other things, AISD. AISD uses the regional growth forecast to decide school siting, which is another funny circular thing, that there's new schools on the edges of town where the forecast said we'd have new kids, and then parents decide that they should move to where that new school is. And all of these things keep happening. And the city's traffic impact analysis process, which is used to debate whether buildings and the Grove, that process is based upon the regional growth forecast, which assumes we won't have things like the Grove. And so this is what we get from that. And it's not great. And there are other equity issues at the regional level. Our region is one of the last of the Texas's major metros to not quite be an all minority place where we are all minorities here together. But fairly soon our region will be all minority, where all of us are together in this and there is no majority race or ethnicity. But we're not there yet. So 45% of the people of our region are people of color. And the Campo Transportation Policy Board, and actually since I did this research, it's changed a little, and there's one less person of color. So that 10% of the voting seats on the Campo board are people of color in a region where 45% of our people. 30% of the voting seats on that board are women, which generally half of people are women. And so there's real equity issues in these regional decisions. And so we've have some very complicated plans that we're working on to address these. But this is something we could change, but it would take respecting the people who are in power now. It would take sort of discussions like, if there's not enough chairs at the table, then let's bring some new chairs. It would take finding ways for the people who benefit from the system to be okay with it, but we need to fix it. But change is happening across Austin. We're adding 50,000 people every year. And if you look at just how neighborhoods change in terms of are there more or less people of color in that neighborhood over the last 5 years, or if you look at if there are more or less non-Hispanic white people, one way to look at this is that the entirety of Austin is changing rapidly. We're adding white people and people of color all over. We are subtracting white people and people of color all over. And so it's a very complex picture, but the real people are suffering in this mix of data, which we don't have very much data on the real people who suffer displacement and who really are struggling because of these forces, and it deserves attention. One key that I've sort of been playing with this lately, I just think it's amazing that the experience of housing type is different based on race in Austin. And if you are a non-Hispanic white person, 71% of you live in a single family home, whereas people of color, it's more like 55%. And so if we have public policies that favor single family homes, what does that mean? And things like that. And then renters. Austin is a majority renter city. A big chunk of those are people renting single family homes. But the majority of the people living in Austin are renting their house. And so if we have policies that favor home ownership, like homestead exemptions and increasing homestead exemptions, what does that mean? And is that fair, and is that building the city we want? Another element I wanted to bring into this is that I had a unique experience 4 years ago now. I contracted a rare genetic disorder called Guillain-Barré syndrome, where you go from walking one day to kind of not being able to get up the stairs to being quadriplegic about in a 3-day period. And it's where your immune system attacks your own nerves. However, it's something that sort of happens, and you have to just sit in the hospital for 2 months, and then it's over, and then you recover, and you can. And I was lucky enough to sort of come all the way back. But that experience was very weird in lots of ways. But the experience, when I got out of the hospital, I was still in a wheelchair. And I was really bored of being in a hospital. And I was really bored of, it was a life-changing experience to have people take care of me very intimately, people I don't know. However, I was somewhat bored of that, and I wanted to take care of myself when I was out. And so I was in Houston at the time, tried to get around Houston in a wheelchair, and that's really something. And the issues, we have to be thinking of all these things for all our people. We need to build a city and a region for all our people. And we have to be able to think through the lens of what it's like. And so on the street safety transportation issues, there are equity issues. And if you're a person of color and you're a senior, you're more likely to get hit while you're walking. You're more likely to be hurt as a pedestrian. We did this kind of fun people-powered bike ped survey in Houston, where we had people out on the street with a sheet of paper counting how many people were riding by on a bike and how many people were walking and how many cars. And so one of the things we sort of found from that is that the higher income of your area, the less we saw people walking and biking. And that's a general thread, is that lower income people generally have less access to cars, generally are going to be more likely to need to walk somewhere or use transit. And so if we are across the board focused on car transportation, that's a serious equity issue. One of the interesting things we found is the places where you saw more people walking and biking were also the places where you saw more people driving, which, when you come to think of it, makes sense that all of us are trying to get to the same places, and we're always, wherever it is people are trying to get to in their cars is also where people are trying to get to when they're walking and biking. And this is really the argument that's why we need we need to do the difficult work of making streets that work for everyone, and then not try to segregate the bike paths over there and the high-speed car here. We need to figure out how to build streets that works for all of us, because we're all trying to go to the same places. And that has to do with capacity and how much can we fit in one street. And the car priority lane that we're used to can't really carry a lot of people, and that's a lot of our problems, is that we keep using this model of car priority lanes, whereas transit lanes, bike lanes can actually carry a lot more people to places. And this is a health issue too. And the more people walk and bike, the less you have high obesity rates. And so this vehicle miles traveled that we address as a problem in Austin, it's a bigger problem here than Houston, this is all the metropolitan planning organizations for Texas have all these acronyms, but HGAC means Houston, NCTCOG is Dallas. So we actually are driving more in Austin than Houston per person. And the result is our traffic deaths are higher because we're exposed to the risk more. We're driving more, we're exposing people to more risk. So we can start doing things differently. We can build a transit-oriented Austin. We can build people the option of having low-carbon, walkable lifestyles. We have parts of the Austin region today that are the darkest green on this map have enough density to support light rail efficiently. And if you have enough density to support light rail, it's actually one of the cheapest forms of transportation per use. Houston's Main Street Light Rail line, which is one of the most successful modern light rail lines in the nation, costs the Metro in Houston about $1.26 per ride. Whereas the best bus service in Texas is something like $2 or $3 per ride. And we don't have any data on how much it costs to drive. But I assure you it's more than $2 on most trips, the costs imposed. So we can look at things through an equity lens. Capital Metro used the way we looked at it, and the proposals that are coming in June will be transformative and will change bus access for a lot of people in Austin. It will mean sort of access to a high-frequency bus grid. But we looked at how many low-income people would be within walking distance of this network. But we need to not just do that for transit agencies. We're also looked at the Campo call for funding, where they're going to spend $400 million across the region. And we found that the projects that were selected happen to have less people of color near them than the projects that were not selected, and also less zero vehicle households, and also less low-income people. So we need to use these lenses to tune our investments across the region better. And we could do some amazing things. The plan for Austin, the Project Connect plan, is a tremendously beautiful transit plan from a transit nerd. A lot of transit nerds fought over this plan for years and made them make it a good plan. And it would mean a light rail line on Lamar at Guadalupe. So from here we would be able to walk to that light rail line. And it would mean, but other things, bus rapid transit lines across the city. So this would provide a lot of people with very high quality access to low carbon lifestyles. And we can think about the whole Texas Triangle mega region as being connected in the same way, and connecting the places where all the people are. And there's a company that is claiming they will have high-speed rail from Houston to Dallas running in 2023. And Austin can be seriously talking about these ideas. How do we connect to Houston and Dallas? Or we can invest in parking spots. And now it gets into the Code Next section, and I'll hurry up. But we did a sort of back-of-the-envelope calculation, and the Code Next version 2, which essentially changes Austin's parking regulations to only require about one parking spot per average for every housing unit created, whereas currently it's about 2. And on general, parking spots cost $15,000 to do, and that's sort of averaging out doing a parking spot in your yard and doing big parking garages. But in general, there's a rule of thumb in development world, $15,000. So over the next 10 years, if we had passed Code Next version 2, with the expected amount of housing units that were going to be built, the city would have required the community to invest $2.6 billion in parking spots, which would be, you could instead invest that in 17,000 affordable housing units if you wanted. So here's where we are in Code Next. And this is a house in Austin. It's a house with two signs. And one sign says, no matter where you are from, we're glad you're our neighbor. And the other sign says, no matter where you're from, maybe we don't think there's room for you in this neighborhood, though. And so we are a house divided in Austin, and we have to learn to talk to each other. We have to learn to figure this out. But we're not there yet. And I have a 4-year-old now, and I read him Dr. Seuss books, and there's a Dr. Seuss page about how there's too many nutches for how many niches there are, and so the nutches have to watch their niche, or so other nutch will snitch. And it seems here we are, but we're all nutches here, and we have to figure it out. So I came up with a way to visualize it in terms of squares. Here's the city of Austin today, 405,000 homes. And here's the people that are coming to our region over the next 10 years, which we need about 335,000 homes. We have a couple of proposals on the table. The current zoning rules would allow about 170,000 more people to live in the city of Austin, whereas Code Next version 3 would allow about 380,000. And so we can imagine two scenarios that are Austin 10 years from now. The red part in these maps is just the new people coming. And a lot of times when people are moving to Texas, people are moving to Austin, in general, they don't move to Pflugerville from wherever they're coming from. In general, people move to the core, and then next year, maybe they move out or someone else moves out. And so, no matter what happens, we have this giant blob coming to Austin. Which a lot of that is, about a third of that is just people here having babies, because we're a young region in general. And so there's been a lot of debate about affordable housing programs and how much affordable units we can get out of the bonus program and Code Next. And so when you're talking about the scale that we're talking about, those are pretty small things. And we're talking about the current zoning would allow about 2,000 affordable housing bonus units, and Code Next version 3 would allow about 8,000. However, there have been studies that show that providing affordable housing, subsidized affordable housing, does work, and it does block displacement, and it keeps communities together and allows people to live in their city. However, adding market rate housing also works, but not quite as fast at a rate. But for every 2 new units you add, it's the same as adding 1 unit of direct subsidized affordable housing. And so if we accept that paper and that research, we can have 2 different pictures of the future of Austin and what happens by allowing more people to live in the city of Austin, allowing more units. There would be more single-family houses that exist today will stay somewhat affordable single-family houses. More apartments that exist today will stay more affordable. And if we choose not to allow more people to live in Austin, one of the impacts will be this displacement. But we have to think of this as a regional picture, and the picture is how are we growing as a region. And this is us today, and with our current zoning, there will be 824,000 units outside the city, and these will be those places where people drive a lot more. This is the traffic nightmare that we talk about. The TxDOT tells you congestion will go through the roof forever because of this nightmare. So Code Next version 3 would not solve those problems, but it would cut it down significantly. We would still have a lot of problems, but we could reduce vehicle miles traveled, greenhouse gas emissions by allowing people to live in the city of Austin. One of the ways we've looked at this is just using all that data on density and greenhouse gas emissions. Using actual neighborhoods in Austin, we developed an equation of the relationship of those two things. And essentially, each person either allowed to live in the city of Austin versus out in the region means 0.46 metric tons less of carbon emissions every year. So if you multiply that out times the more amount of people allowed to live here, if we do Code Next version 3, it comes out to be equivalent to planting 1.96 million trees a year. Every single year, planting another 2 million trees. That's the carbon equivalence of Code Next version 3 versus current zoning from a transportation greenhouse gas emissions perspective. And impervious surface is another one where we actually can look at data and see what the people of Austin actually, how much surface do you need for your life? And that's buildings, parking lots, roads, and there are fairly different parts of Austin. And just District 9 and District 4, which is sort of downtown and then Hyde Parky and stuff up there, those areas have the least impervious surface per capita. So if you're concerned about flooding, about water quality, you'd want to encourage more places to be like those. And from a regional perspective, the people of Travis County, each one of us in Travis County essentially has, TxDOT and the cities and counties have created for us 651 square feet of road, which I live in a traditional duplex that's 650 square feet. So TxDOT has provided as much road as my house for me. However, if you live out in Bastrop County, it's 2,440 square feet of road surface per person. And so these are the numbers we want to change. We want to allow people to live their lives without needing so much road. And so we really have options of, if we were to keep the current zoning, we would move over the next 10 years to be slightly worse than Houston in terms of impervious surface per capita. And if we went with Code Next version 2, we would get moved towards Pittsburgh and Minneapolis and some other cities. And we need to allow people to live, more people to live in the area where we can provide good transit. And so we've been looking a lot at a map of sort of Austin's transit-oriented zone. And it's not just the metro rail stations. It's places where there's high-quality transit. And that means metro rail stations, that means metro rapid stations, that means where this frequent grid network will meet in the future. And these are places where, as a community, I believe the priority of allowing people to live low-carbon lifestyles is a higher priority than other potential concerns with density in these places. It doesn't seem okay to require parking here. And one more, and then, so this is a transit-oriented type place with working class people, your nurses and your doctors and everyone. And we should have some places like this. And we can imagine the parking lots really are the problem. So it's just fun sometimes to imagine if you just took the parking lots of, say, Lakeline Mall, and you installed West Campus there, and didn't take any inch of green space, and it simply took the worst thing, the parking lot, which reflects heat, contributes to our heat island, causes people to drive, and replaced it with places for people to live and work and play. You could imagine the DPS site right over here, and what if we put West Campus in there? And what would that provide for my son when he grows up? And would he have options for affordable apartments there? And would he have jobs? So it's all about this picture of regional growth, and I hope we can find ways to allow healthy, low-carbon lifestyles to do our part to save the planet. And I wanted to note that if any of you want to get involved here at the church on these kind of issues and all kinds of environmental issues, you should get involved in the church's Green Sanctuary Committee. And because as I said, there's sort of the story of what's better than planting a tree today is planting a tree 30 years ago. But what's even better is constantly planting lots of trees and herbs and like gardens for birds, and to have a culture of sustainability. And if we could, there's a lot of different things that all of us need to do to make this work out. Thank you.
Now we're gonna, am I on? Is it working? We're gonna have time for a few questions. Please, keep your questions brief and to the point, and if you do disagree, please do so from a place of curiosity and respect. If you'd stand up and introduce yourself.
Hi, Emil Otis.
Hi.
I've been a Metro Transit user for like the past 5 years.
Yeah.
Or actually a little longer than that, little by little, so I've seen the transformation. Yeah, lots of great questions. Thank you very much for a lot of that information. Starting with that last point you were starting to make about transformation of hotspots into this, so the Highland Mall region now, or the area. So that seems like that's a model of the transformation you're talking about. So how is that going? Is that sort of the only model right now in this region that is what you're describing as building the density?
Right.
You know what I'm talking about? Because they are doing that, right?
Right.
That plan is like filling out.
Right, and I think that particular plan stalled for some reasons, but now it's happening. But there are other examples. I mean, the triangle right here was, back when I was in college, that was a fight, but that used to be a grassy triangle.
Wait.
Right.
You've got to be on the microphone.
Yeah, so I think there are examples, and that's probably one of the better examples of that kind of transformation. So,
is it having the impact that will it have the impact? And about sort of what is that plan to be sort of completed? Do you know the
right, I
schedule on
think
that?
the Highland Mall plan is wonderful. It's, it will have very good transit access. It'll be a walkable urban space and a college and jobs and retail and lots of things. So it appears to be going along, but
And there's a metro stop right there.
and
too.
there's so, but I think basically I don't think very many people have moved in. They've just been building things in the last year. So we'll see.
Hi, thank you so much for your very in-depth presentation of profound data that we need to understand. There are two elements I didn't hear in your presentation that concern me, and the proposed density. I mean, we're talking about doubling the population of this city by 2040. And water and air seem to me to be two things that are profoundly at risk. With the kind of transportation we have now, much less doubling that, the air we would have available to us to breathe would be at risk, it seems to me. And we are already in a drought. And if you look at our drought history, we're in increasing droughts. So sometimes to hear the kind of numbers you and other planners think about boggles my mind, because I don't think we have the resources to of water and air.
Yeah.
There are other resources, of course, too, but those two elements alone don't seem to make these kinds of projections of numbers sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a legitimate concern. We have a limited planet and a growing number of humans. And I think most demographers agree that the human population is going to continue growing and level out sometime after 2050. So the whole planet's going to have to keep dealing with more of us unless something very radical happens, which the biggest thing that you can do to change that picture of human population growth is to educate women worldwide. However, Texas is growing, and so when I talk about adding 700,000 people to the Austin region, I'm not hoping for that. That's the demographer's story. A lot of that growth, a third of that growth is people here having babies, and most of that growth is people moving to Austin from other parts of Texas. And so my opinion is we have to then deal with that, and that the only way to slow population growth in Texas is radical worldwide catastrophe. And so if that's not on the table, if we don't want that on the table, then we have to do something. And
But it is on the table. We are currently having worldwide catastrophe. People are immigrating by the tens of millions,
right,
because worldwide catastrophe in the form of droughts is
right,
already underway. And the kind of water or lack of water that I'm worried that we might not have, as well as the degradation of our air, are things that are happening. They're not, I just don't hear them being articulated in the plan. And I'm concerned that if we don't articulate them,
right,
then you're planning in a vacuum. You're planning for things that, you're planning leaving out critical elements that could change the
right,
the map.
I completely agree with, I am very concerned about what you are concerned about, and I assure you that what I am trying to talk about is to stop destroying everything. And the current system is a disaster in terms of air and water and land and traffic deaths, and I am trying to change that. So, but I am open to the idea that I'm wrong about particular solutions. So.
Hi, my name is Becky Halpin, and thanks a lot for coming today. And there's almost so much information in there that's great that it's hard to parse it all out. But one thing I would ask that you consider in your presentations is that slide that shows the Code Next opposition with the opposed to the welcoming sign. I think it is perfectly possible to welcome people to Austin, and yet feel that Code Next is flawed enough to oppose that and want it to go back for some rewrites. So I think it's not helpful, or it could be more helpful, to realize that we all want the same thing. We just kind of look at it different, and we don't really want to make one group, out to be bad to the other group. And
right,
I think I would just ask you to reconsider that. The other thing I think is really interesting is we are moving toward an electrification, I think, of transportation, especially with car vehicles. So at some point in the next 20 years, I think instead of worrying too much about the carbon footprint of our cars, we're just really going to be looking at the physical footprint of them more, because we're going to be driving off of, hopefully, a lower carbon grid that will drive our cars, that will power our cars. So I think in some ways Code Next falls a little bit behind on that aspect. So while I hear a lot about parking, which is cars and just their physical presence, has there been any discussion of that, or is Code Next mostly just about physical arrangement of the city and getting people around physically? Did that question make sense?
Yeah,
Okay,
I mean, one answer to it, the city of Austin is doing more on electro-techno answers to all our problems than most American cities. And so the city of Austin is doing very good things. And like I was saying, we need to be planting trees and shrubs, and we need to be doing a lot of things. And electrification is a crucial element that will in no way solve all our problems. Like everything else, Code Next won't solve or cause all of our problems, and electrification won't either. But there is it's about consumption. It's about how much need you have to travel. And electrification is about changing the rate of damage per mile of consumption. But it's not going to go to zero. And so we need to also change the rate of consumption. It's the same as recycling. Drinking 10 sodas a day and recycling them isn't really solving the problem.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. We have another question. If you'd stand up and introduce yourself.
My name is Dick Kellerman. Austin, like most cities, has had zoning over the years, SB1, SB5, saying what can be built where, so we get fairly homogeneous neighborhoods. Houston never had much in the way of zoning, And going back in past years, we laugh and say, oh, they're going to build a gas station next to your house. You know, Houston's in terrible shape. Come to find out, Houston has integrated neighborhoods with a lot of population, and now we've got code next to turn us into Houston. That's maybe a little bit of oversimplification, but we want our neighborhoods to absorb more people, and Houston's been doing that for 100 years.
Yeah, I would somewhat agree that's the story of Houston. Houston has its own, Houston requires parking. And so you can use the building for whatever you want, but you better pay a parking spot. You better subsidize driving. And there's also deed restrictions in Houston to some extent almost amount to zoning. And so, but in some ways Houston has allowed for density and more affordable urbanism and different housing options in ways that other cities have not. And so we'll see. Personally, I don't, I grew up in Houston, and I always was kind of a liberal fighting against the libertarians in Houston. But I don't understand why we want to segregate uses. I think it's a terrible mistake. I want my son to be able to walk places. I want a corner store at the end of my block. And I think that's been a failed experiment in segregating uses. And I think one could look at some stories of what has happened in Houston to try to understand that. So.
We have a couple minutes left. Are you still having those breakfasts? I know I came to one of your breakfast meetings that was really informative. Are you going to be starting those up again?
We finished the series, and we're focused on publishing a series of reports that were we did a open iterative research process of having these breakfast events and having panels and having discussions. And so now we're in the process of finishing all the reports. There may be some in the future. Find out at farmandcity.org.
So we're almost out of time. I know if people want to ask you some questions off camera, they could probably come up and talk with you some more. Thank you very much for coming out today.
Thank you all so much for having me here.